Can you believe it's been roughly a year since Animal Crossing New Horizons came out? And, nothing else? There's nothing else we would commemorate in March 2021, especially something disastrous and closely associated with New Horizons that helped reach a lot of people through such a tragedy. Anyway, I've explained before that this is the first Animal Crossing game I ever tried, and I owe it at least a fraction of my sanity in addition to hours I spent obsessing over villagers. The candy-colored animals that make up your island populace. There's something so bizarrely addicting about the Animal Crossing villagers that gave me this collect-em-all mentality I haven't had since my earliest days of playing Pokemon. And in honor of it being a whole year of observing these comfort creatures, I wanted to run through some of my personal favorites and talk about the million ways I imprint upon them and build insane personal interpretations. And it's sort of bonkers I have the capacity to do even that, since among the nearly 400 villagers, there are only 8 personalities that'll determine their dialogue. Normal, jock, sisterly, smug, peppy, cranky, snooty, and lazy. And yet between their choice of clothing, home decor, favorite song, and catchphrase, there's a lot to settle each one apart, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Let me demonstrate by starting with my favorite villager, and the surefire way to get people to stop watching this video, Rodney. I know that sounds ironic, but I genuinely love this smug yo-yo with all my heart. Rodney is sometimes suggested to get his name from the guinea pig of the same name from Disney's Dr. Dolittle, but I'm more willing to wager that Rodney is simply a play on rodent, considering he is indeed a hamster. I love how a villager's name can be extremely portentous for them. I remember meeting Kevin and wondering why there was a pig named Kevin, until it hit me like a ton of bricks. Anyway, Rodney is a hamster, a rodent which in real life is extremely solitary in nature and actually hates having a den mate, adding a lot of layers to the smug villager dialogue in which Rodney describes himself as shy and prone to overcompensate. Rodney's favorite song is KK Rockabilly, a pretty on-the-nose allusion to one of the earliest forms of rock and roll, the rockabilly style popularized in the 1950s by artists like Elvis and Buddy Holly. This clicks pretty resonantly when you step into Rodney's home, which is decked out in diner memorabilia and old-school games like pinball, arcade video cabinets, and ping pong. Connected to the rockabilly style of the 50s, Rodney's simple bar t-shirt suddenly speaks volumes to his interests, as well as his love for ice cream sundaes, sodas, and burgers. Considering the 1950s was also the rise of consumerism in America, the first era where television was in most homes, which is why very specific brands like Coca-Cola and Chevrolet automobiles are so prominent in rockabilly subculture. This explains why Rodney's abode is practically cramped with memorabilia, as he harkens to an era where it was impressive to indulge in name brands you saw on TV as a symbol of status, which in turn befits the eclectic, persnickety, and eccentric personality of a smug villager. Now, really, I don't know how much of that was intentional, or anything besides a huge stretch, but the simplicity of villagers as they are let one's mind soar with possibilities like these. In a game like Animal Crossing, where personal customization and fulfillment is its bread and butter, it's super neat that these characters have all the right pieces that leave blanks to fill, but also leave small hints to draw one in and inspire that spark in the first place. And no matter what your niche interest or subculture is, there's a villager for you. On the flip side of Rodney's strictly retro vibe is my favorite cranky villager, Sid, whose mohawk and dragon coat quickly invoke a punk rock aesthetic. And as if you needed to ask, his favorite song is KK Metal. His name is probably supposed to be evocative of the rock star of Sex Pistols fame, Sid Vicious. While I like to think his species is a more contemporary shout-out to the modern rock band Cage the Elephant. A metalhead like Sid may seem to stick out like a sore thumb in the happy-go-lucky world of Animal Crossing, but Crankies are big softies at their core, and he's got good company and a couple other villagers he can rock out with. So when neighbors have a battle of rockabilly and metal, who plays their music louder? The answer is probably Puddles, whose peppy personality and preference to KK disco and very funky belted blouse paint her as a force to be reckoned with. Sometimes these interpretations can be filled with knowing about the animal of topic themselves as opposed to the villager's outward appearance. My favorite jock is Snake, and I don't normally care for how often jocks talk about sports, but Snake plays the best sport of them all, ninja, and is therefore ultimately valid. At the risk of employing an old cliche, ninjas are often associated with their ninja clan and close, large brotherhoods, which I like being tied to a rabbit since they're known for having such huge burrow families, meaning Snake probably has the biggest ninja clan of all. And on a more specific reach, here's my favorite sisterly villager, Agnes, who I mostly loved for aesthetics at first glance. Black and pink is just a neat color combo, and her dark pattern and markings harken back to a Berkshire pig, a breed I always found really appealing. What struck me over time about Agnes, however, was her sort of somber attitude. She's rarely seen smiling, and her personal portrait displays a rather ominous quote, "You reap what you sow." Puns aside, it always gave me the idea that Agnes was sort of an unrecognized savant, distressed by her own intellect, but not too much to be your friend. Think Lisa Simpson. After all, pigs are some of the most intelligent animals out there. The inner workings of Agnes's mind are an enigma. Again, that's a pretty huge stretch, but such a stretch of the imagination is fun. More obvious is an illusion like the one made by Ed, clearly named after the eponymous sitcom horse, Mr. Ed. Ed has been in quite a few Animal Crossing games, and is one of the handful of villagers to have his personality changed over the years. He was a jock in his first couple of appearances, but he was changed into a smug villager in his more recent iterations. This tracks pretty intuitively. It's easy to connect the dots between a racehorse or a show pony, and I always like to think Ed started as a bushy-tailed jock who loved competition, only to hit it big and let success turn him smug and full of himself. Mr. Ed was always a pretty cynical character after all. If that's who they're trying to invoke, no arc would fit better. For heaven's sake, he's grown so full of himself that he's one of the few villagers in New Horizons who comes equipped in his house with a portrait of himself. As complex as all of that sounds, a lot of villagers really are straightforward, and perhaps they can't get more so than the first villager ever designed, Bob. And yeah, that's the proto-villager all right. I love how his yellow eyes offset the purple fur. Bob's name is clearly a play on bobcat, and while I don't think they're lazy animals per se, given how often they're spotted vacating up into trees for some shut-eye, the lazy personality suits Bob well. They're nocturnal too, so they leave their bed about as often as any lazy villager. But I can't talk about cats without talking about the one who was his own pajamas when New Horizons was at its height, the one and only Raymond. Yes, he was everywhere for a few months, but honestly, he has such a snazzy design that I can't even really argue with that. A sort of meta idea began to surround Raymond of how crazily people coveted having him, used him as leverage, and traded him for insane asks, creating a narrative that Raymond has a lonely and put-upon personality searching for a place that won't trade him away. Taking into account what an unfortunately high number of cats are abandoned every day, mixed with Raymond's aesthetic of a business employee who also fits the bill of being exploited and transferred despite his inclination, it all suits a really lovably heartbreaking package for Raymond. Considering office cats are a growing cultural landmark as well, the character just comes together so organically, and it's no wonder he has so many fans, a figure of worship who could give the revered cats of ancient Egypt that inspired Anka a run for their money. And it's just little concepts like those that work so well and make villagers so memorable. A bandaged up dog named Lucky, a sad horse named Elmer, a bunch of Power Rangers. This video was so easy to start, but I find it hard to wrap up because there's way too many villagers with even tiny neat touches that deserve credit. And that's just my weird brain. I can think of so many villagers that other people adore and probably have a million notions and interpretations of that I never thought twice about. And that turns them into kind of vicarious favorites of mine, and that's wonderful too. Animal Crossing is the ultimate virtual dollhouse, and the ingredients put into every villager are an inseparable part of that.